I am Nia, 32 years old, and my job as a healthcare compliance officer is to hunt down fraud and ensure people pay for their mistakes. I have spent my career exposing doctors who steal millions and executives who hide assets, yet in my own home, I was treated like a child with no voice. My stepfather Otis saw me only as an obstacle between him and my late father's money. He thought his position as a church deacon made him untouchable. He was wrong. My stepfather Otis slapped me across the face last night because I refused to sign away my inheritance. He thought violence would break me. Instead, it woke me up. 12 hours later, I stood on the front porch with a cold mimosa in my hand, watching the police drag him out in handcuffs while the church neighbors watched in shock. He forgot that hitting a compliance officer is not just domestic abuse, it is a strategic error. He struck me once, so I hit him back with a 10-year prison sentence. And it all started with a Sunday breakfast that he thought was a peace offering. Before we witness Otis lose everything he pretended to own, hit like and subscribe. If you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth, your support helps us share more stories of women who refuse to stay down. At 5 a.m, the house was silent, but my mind was loud with calculation. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the purple bruise blooming across my right cheekbone. I did not cry. Crying swells the eyes and ruins the canvas. Instead, I reached for my expensive NARS concealer, the heavy-duty kind I usually saved for special occasions. I applied layer after layer, blending the pigment into my skin with the precision of a surgeon until the evidence of Otis's rage disappeared beneath a mask of flawless perfection. I dusted translucent powder over the work, setting it like concrete. Today, I needed to look unbreakable. I walked down to the kitchen, the cool tile floors grounding me. This was the kitchen my father had renovated 2 years before he died, a space meant for love and laughter now occupied by a man who treated it like his personal kingdom. I pulled out the heavy cast iron skillets and began to cook. Not a simple breakfast, but a full southern spread. I chopped onions and peppers with rhythmic sharp strikes. I seared thick cuts of bacon until the fat rendered and the smell filled the house. I started the roux for the shrimp and grits, stirring the pot with a steady hand. I was not cooking out of love. I was preparing the stage. My mother Beatrice came into the kitchen a few minutes later. She looked like a ghost in her own home, her eyes red and swollen from crying silently in the guest room. When she saw me at the stove, she froze. Her hands flew to her mouth, trembling. "Nia, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice thick with fear. "You need to leave. You need to go to a hotel before he wakes up. He was so angry last night. If he sees you here, he might do it again." I did not stop stirring the grits. "I am not going anywhere, Mama," I said, my voice low and even. "I live here. This is Daddy's house, and today is a very important day." "But Nia, please," she begged, coming closer, but afraid to touch me as if I were made of glass. "Just sign the papers. Give him what he wants, so we can have peace. It is just money." I looked at her, then really looked at her. She was 60 years old, but looked 10 years older, worn down by 3 years of marriage to a man who drained her spirit and her bank account. "Peace," I repeated. "There is no peace with a man like Otis, Mama. There is only submission, and I am done submitting." Before she could argue further, we heard the heavy thud of footsteps upstairs. The floorboards creaked. The beast was awake. My mother shrank back against the refrigerator, wiping her eyes frantically, trying to make herself small. I straightened my spine and turned up the heat on the stove. Otis walked into the kitchen a moment later. He was already dressed for church, wearing his 3-piece navy suit and the gold deacon pin on his lapel. He smelled of too much cologne and stale arrogance. He stopped in the doorway, surveying the feast on the table and the woman he had assaulted just hours before. A slow, sickening smile spread across his face. "Well, look at this," he said, his voice booming with false joviality. "I guess you finally learned some respect." He walked past me close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. He did not apologize. He did not look ashamed. He looked victorious. "It is amazing what a little discipline can do." He continued, pulling out the chair at the head of the table. "My father's chair." He sat down and spread his napkin over his lap with deliberate, slow movements. "Fiachi, you were this obedient last night. You would not have that soreness on your face today. But we live and we learn, right, Nia?" He huffed a laugh, expecting me to cower, expecting me to flinch. I turned from the stove holding the pot of coffee. My face was a mask of calm. "Coffee, Otis?" I asked. He drummed his fingers on the table. "Black. And make sure it is hot." I poured the coffee into his mug. As I pulled the pot away, he deliberately jerked his arm, knocking the mug. Hot black liquid splashed over the rim and onto the pristine white tablecloth. It was a power move, a test. He wanted to see if I would snap or if I would serve. "Oops," he said, not looking at me, his eyes fixed on the platter of biscuits. "You are clumsy this morning. Clean that up." I set the coffee pot down. I picked up a cloth and wiped the spill. I did not rush. I did not apologize. I moved with the efficiency of a machine. This small act of servitude was the final lock clicking into place on the trap I had set. He saw a broken stepdaughter. I saw a target who had just lowered his shields. Otis took a bite of a biscuit, chewing loudly. He reached into his leather briefcase that sat by his feet and pulled out a thick document. The paper hit the table with a heavy slap right next to my plate. "Since we are all in such a good mood," he said, his mouth full. "Sign it. I need to take this to the bank tomorrow morning." I looked at the document. It was a second mortgage application leveraging the entire equity of the house to fund an expansion for Otis Auto World, his used car lot that had not sold a vehicle in 3 months. He had already bullied my mother into signing her portion. Now he needed me. "I am not signing this, Otis," I said quietly. He stopped chewing. The air in the kitchen turned ice cold. My mother let out a small whimper from the corner. Otis leaned forward, his face transforming from smug to menacing. The deacon mask slipped, revealing the predator underneath. "You listen to me, little girl," he hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am the man of this house. I say what happens with this money. You think because you have that fancy job downtown, you are better than me. You are nothing." He stood up and leaned over me, invading my personal space, his breath hot on my face. "Brad and Maya are coming over for breakfast in 20 minutes, he said, referencing my sister and her husband. "You know how Brad looks at this family. He thinks we are perfect. If you say one word about last night, or if you refuse to sign that paper when they are here, I will throw you and your mother out on the street before sunset. I will change the locks and burn your clothes. Do you understand me?" I looked him dead in the eyes. I saw the desperation behind the anger. He was drowning in debt, and I was his only life raft. "I understand perfectly, Otis," I said. He sat back down, satisfied. He thought he had won. He thought fear was the ultimate currency. He picked up his fork and pointed it at me. "Good. Now put some of those grits on my plate. And smile, Nia. It is the Lord's Day." I served him the grits. I placed the spoon gently on his plate. I smiled just like he asked, but inside I was checking the time. The guests were about to arrive, and they were bringing the end of his world with them. He thought he was eating a victory meal. He did not know he was chewing on his last moments of freedom. The doorbell chimed, cutting through the thick tension in the kitchen like a knife. In an instant, the monster who had just threatened to throw us onto the street vanished. In his place stood Deacon Otis, the pillar of the community, the loving patriarch. He straightened his tie, smoothed his jacket, and put on a smile so bright it was blinding. It was terrifying to watch how easily he could switch skins. He checked his reflection in the hallway mirror before pulling the door open with a flourish. My sister Maya walked in first, holding a casserole dish, followed closely by her husband Brad. Brad is a software engineer, tall, white, and successful. He is everything Otis envied and wanted to align himself with. To Otis, having a white, wealthy son-in-law was the ultimate status symbol, a trophy he polished every Sunday to prove to the church that his family had made it. Otis bypassed his own stepdaughter to grab Brad's hand in a two-handed shake, pumping it enthusiastically. "Brad, my son," he boomed, his voice dripping with artificial honey. "So good to see you. I hope the drive over was smooth. We have been waiting for you." Brad smiled politely, the nice guy who assumes everyone else is nice too. He hugged my mother, then turned to me. His smile faltered. Brad has an eye for detail. It is what makes him good at coding. He leaned in to hug me and stopped, his eyes narrowing as he looked at my right cheek. Even with the heavy layer of expensive concealer and setting powder, the swelling distorted the symmetry of my face. The bruise was a dark secret trying to push through the paint. "Nia," he said, his voice laced with genuine concern. "You look different. Is your face swollen? Are you okay?" The air left the room. My mother stopped breathing. From the corner of my eye, I saw Otis stiffen. He did not turn his head, but his eyes slid toward me, hard and cold as flint. It was a silent command, a reminder of the threat he had whispered just minutes ago. "Dare to speak, and you are homeless." The silence stretched for a second too long. Otis's smile was frozen, a rictus of panic waiting for my next move. I looked at Brad, then at Otis. I let the fear hang there for a heartbeat, enjoying Otis's sweat, before I delivered the lie he demanded. "I am fine, Brad," I said, forcing a light chuckle. "I was putting away dishes last night and walked right into the open cabinet door. You know me. Clumsy." Otis let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. He slapped his knee and let out a loud, performative laugh. "That is our Nia," he bellowed, clapping Brad on the shoulder. "Always head in the clouds. Come on, sit down. Let us eat before the food gets cold." He thought he was safe. He thought the lie meant I was still under his control. He had no idea that I was just buying time for the real guests to arrive. We settled into the meal, the clinking of silverware filling the silence that my mother was too afraid to break. Otis, however, was in his element. He shoveled grits into his mouth while spinning a fantasy world for Brad. He leaned back in his chair, wiping grease from his lip, and launched into a monologue about Otis Auto World. To hear him tell it, he was a tycoon of the used car industry. "Business is exploding, Brad." He lied, his voice smooth and confident. "We are moving so much inventory, I can barely keep the lot full. In fact, I am looking at a second location over in West Side. Prime real estate." I choked down a piece of bacon. The only thing exploding at his dealership was the unpaid electric bill. I knew for a fact he had not sold a car since February. But Brad nodded along, polite and unsuspecting, feeding the ego of a man who was drowning in debt. Otis beamed, soaking up the admiration he felt he deserved. He was setting the stage, building a facade of success so high that he thought I would be too afraid to knock it down. That was when he made his move. He reached for the document he had slammed down earlier, the second mortgage application disguised as opportunity. He slid it across the white tablecloth, pushing it right next to my coffee cup. It moved like a shark through water. "Nia, honey," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes hard as stones. "Since we are all here and talking business, go ahead and sign that investment paperwork for me. Brad knows how these things go. You have to strike while the iron is hot." He smiled at Brad, then turned that smile on to me. It was a weaponized grin. He was using my brother-in-law as a human shield. He knew I valued Brad's respect. He knew I tried to keep our family dysfunction hidden from Maya's happy marriage. He was betting everything on the fact that I would sign away my father's house rather than cause a scene in front of the successful son-in-law he tried so hard to impress. "It is just a formality, sweetheart," he added, clicking a gold pen and holding it out to me. "Just standard procedure to get the new location running. Do not hold up progress." The pen hovered in front of my face. My mother stopped eating her fork, suspended halfway to her mouth. The room felt suddenly small, the air sucked out by his audacity. He was cornering me, using social pressure like a physical restraint. Sign the paper, keep the peace, save the image, or refuse and watch the monster tear the mask off right here at the breakfast table. He thought he had me trapped in a corner of politeness. He did not realize I had already demolished the room. I reached out and took the cold metal barrel of the pen in my fingers. The relief that washed over Otis was almost physical. He uncrossed his legs and leaned back his chest, puffing out like a rooster that had just scared off a fox. He smirked at me, a nasty, self-satisfied twist of his lips that said, "I own you." He thought the threat of homelessness had done its job. He thought he had successfully weaponized my fear to rob me of my future. I held the pen over the signature line. The ink was ready to flow. Otis was already mentally spending the money. Then, with a deliberate, heavy motion, I set the pen back down on the table. The sharp click of the metal against the wood echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Wait a minute," I said, my voice conversational and light. Otis's smirk faltered. His eyes darted to the pen, then to my face, confusion clouding his arrogance. "What is the problem, Nia?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "Just sign it so we can finish eating. Do not be difficult." I folded my hands on the table, resting them calmly right on top of the mortgage application. "Well, before I commit to another investment, Otis, I think it is just good business practice to review the performance of the last one. Do you not agree?" I looked at Brad. He nodded enthusiastically, chewing on a biscuit, completely unaware of the war being fought across the centerpiece. "Absolutely," Brad chimed in. "Always check the ROI before doubling down. That is rule number 1 in any venture." Otis's face went rigid. The color began to drain from his cheeks, leaving them a sickly gray. He knew exactly what previous investment I was talking about, and he knew it did not exist. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "What returns are you talking about?" I leaned forward, mirroring his posture from earlier. "The funds you moved last month," I said. "The $50,000 for the church roof repairs. We should show Brad how well you managed that capital before asking him to witness another deal." Otis gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He realized too late that the mouse had not only refused the cheese, but had just closed the door to the trap. Otis leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. The mask of the benevolent father figure slipped, completely revealing the desperate, angry man beneath. "Stop playing games," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous growl that barely reached the others. "You sign that paper right now, or I promise you will not have a roof over your head tonight." His hand twitched toward my arm, ready to force compliance physically if he had to. He was done waiting. He was done acting. He wanted his money, and he wanted it now. Just as his fingers brushed my wrist, the doorbell rang again. The sound was sharp and demanding, echoing through the tense silence of the dining room. Otis froze, his hand hovering in midair. He blinked, the aggression momentarily replaced by confusion. Who on earth would be visiting at this hour on a Sunday? He looked at me, suspicion narrowing his eyes, but I was already pushing my chair back. "I will get that," I said, standing up before he could stop me. "That must be the rest of our party." I walked to the front door, feeling Otis's glare burning into my back. I took a deep breath, composed my face into a mask of polite welcome, and swung the door open. 2 men stood on the porch, blocking out the morning sun. The first was a man Otis spent his entire life trying to impress, Pastor Jenkins. He stood tall and solemn in his clerical collar, holding a Bible. Behind him was a man Otis did not know, but would soon learn to fear, Private Investigator Williams, a man with eyes that missed nothing and a briefcase full of ruin. "Please come in," I said, stepping aside. When we walked into the dining room, the effect was immediate. Otis scrambled out of his chair so fast he nearly knocked it over. His napkin fluttered to the floor, forgotten. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Pastor Jenkins," he stammered, his voice cracking. What are you doing here, sir? We were just having breakfast." He looked from the pastor to the stranger in the suit, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. He smoothed his jacket with trembling hands, trying to salvage his dignity. "I invited them, Otis," I said, walking to the head of the table. Otis whipped his head around to look at me, betrayal and terror warring in his eyes. "I thought since we were discussing your financial contributions and your investments, it was only right to have a witness." I continued, my voice steady and cold. "After all, a man as generous as you claims to be should want his pastor to see exactly where the church's money is going. And Mr. Williams here, well, he is just here to help us verify the math." Otis looked at the pastor, then at the investigator, and finally at me. For the first time all morning, the arrogance was gone. In its place was the sheer naked terror of a man who realized his secrets had just walked through the front door. Otis sank into his chair, shrinking into his suit that suddenly seemed 2 sizes too big. The bravado he had worn like armor just minutes ago had evaporated, leaving behind a sweating, trembling man who could not meet the eyes of the guests I had seated around him. Pastor Jenkins sat on Otis's right, his posture rigid and unforgiving. Investigator Williams sat opposite, placing his briefcase on the floor with a heavy thud that sounded like a gavel striking a block. Brad and Maya looked between us, confused and terrified, sensing that the family breakfast had just become a tribunal. I walked to the sideboard where I had left the coffee pot. But instead of refilling mugs, I reached into the drawer and pulled out a thick navy blue presentation folder. I held it with both hands, feeling the weight of the evidence inside. It was heavy with secrets Otis thought he had buried deep enough to never be found. I walked back to the table and stood behind my mother's chair, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. She was shaking, but she did not pull away. "Otis," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "You wanted to talk about investments. You wanted to talk about where money goes in this family. So let us talk." I opened the folder. The sound of the stiff cardboard bending was the only noise in the room. I pulled out the first document, a crisp bank statement with key lines highlighted in neon yellow. I slid it across the table, not to Otis, but directly to Pastor Jenkins. "Pastor," I began, keeping my eyes fixed on my stepfather. "Last month, Deacon Otis stood in front of the congregation and announced a generous donation of $20,000 to the building fund for the new church roof. He received a standing ovation. He let people shake his hand and call him a godly man." Pastor Jenkins nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "I remember that Sunday well, Sister Nia. We have been waiting for the check to clear." I pointed to the highlighted line on the paper in front of him. "You were waiting for a check that was never written, Pastor. That document is a subpoenaed record of Otis's personal checking account, the one he keeps separate from my mother. On the very same day he pledged that money to God, a transfer of exactly $20,000 was made, but it did not go to the church building fund." Otis made a strangled noise in his throat, reaching out as if to cover the paper, but Investigator Williams cleared his throat, a low warning rumble that made Otis freeze. "Read the recipient, Pastor," I urged gently. Pastor Jenkins adjusted his glasses and leaned down. His lips moved silently as he read, and then his face flushed a deep, angry red. He looked up at Otis, his expression transforming from confusion to righteous fury. "Riverboat Casino." The pastor read aloud, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You took the Lord's money to a gambling boat." The room erupted. Maya gasped, covering her mouth. Brad looked at Otis as if he were seeing a stranger. Otis was shaking his head frantically, sweat dripping down his temples. No, Pastor, you do not understand." Otis stammered, his hands waving uselessly in the air. "It looks bad, I know, but that was a strategic move. I was trying to double the money. I was going to turn that $20,000 into $40,000 for the roof. I was doing it for the church. I was trying to bless the congregation with even more abundance. You were trying to count cards at a blackjack table with stolen money, Otis." I cut in, my voice sharp. "And you lost every cent of it in 4 hours. The timestamps on the withdrawals prove it. You did not invest in the kingdom. You invested in a slot machine and came home broke." Otis slumped in his chair, the excuse dying on his lips as he realized the absurdity of his own lie. He had gambled away his reputation, and now he was about to lose everything else. I turned my attention to my brother-in-law. Brad had been sitting in stunned silence watching the pastor berate Otis. He still wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding. He was a good man who trusted family. That was exactly what Otis had counted on. "Brad," I said softly, drawing his gaze away from the sweating man at the end of the table. "You work in data security. You know better than anyone how dangerous it is when personal information gets into the wrong hands." I slid a second stack of papers across the tablecloth. These were not bank statements. They were credit reports, detailed multi-page summaries of financial history that no one should see without permission. "Take a look at the open accounts section on the last page," I directed him. Brad picked up the papers, his brow furrowing. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the columns of numbers. Beside him, Maya leaned in her hand, covering her mouth, as she recognized her own Social Security number at the top of the page. "What is this?" Brad asked, his voice confused. "These are credit card statements for accounts I never opened. Platinum rewards." "Travel Elite. Maya, did you apply for these?" Maya shook her head frantically, tears welling in her eyes. "No, Brad. I have never seen these banks before." "Of course you have not," I said, my voice hardening, "because the mailing address for all 3 cards is a post office box in Otis's name, and the total outstanding balance across all 3 is just over $45,000. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Brad looked up from the papers, his face draining of color, and then flushing with a deep, furious crimson. The polite, mild-mannered engineer vanished. In his place was a man realizing he had been violated by the person he sat across from at Thanksgiving dinner. Otis tried to shrink into his chair, mumbling something about a bridge loan or a temporary fix. "Now, son, listen. I was going to pay it back before the first statement even hit. It was just to get the inventory moving." Brad slammed his hand down on the table so hard the silverware jumped. The sound was like a thunderclap in the small room. He stood up, towering over the table, his eyes blazing with a rage I had never seen before. "Do not call me son!" Brad shouted, his voice shaking with intensity. "You stole our identities. You compromised my credit rating and my wife's financial future to buy used cars. I trusted you. I defended you when people said you were shady. And this is how you repay us." Otis flinched as if he had been struck. The image of the perfect patriarch, the man who commanded respect and admiration, shattered into 1,000 pieces right there on the dining room floor. He looked at Brad, then at the pastor, and saw no mercy in either of their faces. He was alone. "It is a felony," Brad spat out, tossing the papers back at him, "identity theft and wire fraud, and I will make sure you answer for every single penny." The walls were closing in, but I was not done yet. I still had one more document in my folder, and it was the one that would end his reign in this house forever. The air in the room shifted instantly from shock to danger. Otis looked around the table, realizing his lies had crumbled and he had nowhere left to run. The humiliation was too much for his fragile ego to bear. He did not see family anymore. He saw enemies. With a guttural roar that sounded nothing like a man of God, Otis lunged across the table. His chair scraped violently against the floorboards as he threw his weight forward. He was not reaching for me to apologize. He was reaching for the blue folder, his fingers hooked into claws, desperate to destroy the evidence that was ruining him. "You ungrateful little witch!" he screamed, spit flying from his mouth as he scrambled over the centerpiece. "Give me those papers right now." He never made it to me. Investigator Williams moved with the speed of a man who spent 20 years in law enforcement. He stood up and clamped a heavy hand on Otis's shoulder, forcing him back down into his seat with crushing weight. It was not a suggestion. It was an anchor. "Sit down," Mr. Jackson Williams said, his voice low and dangerous, vibrating with authority. "I have not even opened my briefcase yet. You do not want to add assault on a private investigator to your list of problems today. Keep your hands on the table." Otis fell back into his chair, panting, his eyes wild and darting around the room. The room was silent, vibrating with the violence that had just almost happened. I stood up slowly. I picked up a wet towelette from the bread basket, the kind usually reserved for sticky fingers after a meal. I looked at Brad, then at my mother, and finally at Otis. I brought the cloth to my face. With one hard, deliberate swipe, I dragged it across my right cheek. The layers of expensive foundation and setting powder streaked away onto the white cloth, revealing the ugly purple and black truth hiding underneath. The bruise was dark and swollen, the distinct outline of 4 fingers stamped into my skin like a brand of ownership. A strangled cry broke from Maya's throat. She covered her eyes, unable to look at her big sister's face. My mother put her head on the table and sobbed, a sound of pure heartbreak and guilt. Brad stared at the mark on my face, his jaw tight, his hands clenching into fists on the tablecloth until his knuckles turned white. He looked ready to jump across the table and finish what Otis started. I dropped the makeup-stained cloth onto Otis's empty plate right next to the biscuit he had been enjoying. This is what happened last night when I said no to his mortgage scheme. I said, my voice dead calm, "This is the man who leads prayer service on Sundays. Take a good look, everyone. This is the real face of Deacon Otis." The silence in the room was broken by a sound that made my skin crawl. Otis started to laugh. It was not a happy sound. It was the jagged, manic cackle of a man watching the world burn and deciding to pour gasoline on the fire. He looked at the makeup wipe on his plate, then at the police investigator, and finally at me. His eyes were wet and wide, filled with a toxic mix of panic and spite. "Fine," he spat, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You got me. Maybe I will go to jail for embezzlement. Maybe Brad will press charges for the credit cards. But you are forgetting one thing, little girl. You are forgetting who is the king of this castle." He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, reclaiming the arrogance he had lost just moments before. "This house," he sneered, looking around the dining room, "this beautiful house your daddy left you, it is still half mine. And if I am going down, I am taking this roof with me. I will never sign a sale agreement. I will never authorize a transfer. I will let this place rot into the ground from my prison cell before I let you have it." He turned his gaze to my mother, his expression twisting into pure cruelty. "Tell her, Beatrice. Tell your smart daughter what you did last year. Tell her how you signed the power of attorney and added my name to the deed because I told you it was for tax purposes." My mother let out a sound that broke my heart. It was a sob so deep it shook her entire small frame. She buried her face in her hands, unable to look at me. "Nia," she gasped, her voice thick with tears. "I am so sorry. He told me it was to protect the estate. He said if something happened to me, he needed to be able to pay the bills. I signed the papers. I gave him half the house." Otis laughed again, louder this time. "She is so stupid," he taunted. "She handed me the keys to the kingdom because she was desperate to keep a man. So go ahead, call the cops. But remember, as long as my name is on that deed, I can block you from doing anything. You are stuck with me, Nia. Even from a jail cell, I own you." He looked at me with pure triumph, thinking he had played his final ace. He thought the legal system was a shield he could hide behind. He had no idea that I had not just studied the law, I had weaponized it against him. Otis sat there with a smug grin, waiting for my mother to wail and for me to beg. He thought the legal system was his shield. He thought a piece of paper my mother signed in a moment of weakness was his golden ticket to torture us forever. I picked up my coffee cup. It was cold now, but I took a slow, deliberate sip, staring at him over the rim. I set the cup down with a soft click that sounded like a judge's gavel. "You know Otis, for a man who claims to be a business tycoon, you really should keep a closer eye on your financial correspondence," I said, my voice conversational. "Do you not check the notices sent to your private post office box?" Otis furrowed his brow, the arrogance flickering for a second. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the table. "You are right about one thing. Mom did sign over half the deed, but you forgot what you did with that equity 6 months ago. You were desperate after a bad streak at the tables, so you took out a high-interest private loan against your share of this property, a predatory loan with a very strict default clause." I watched his eyes widen. He remembered. "You missed your third payment 2 weeks ago, Otis. That loan went into default immediately. The lender did not want the house, they wanted their cash, so they put the debt note up for auction on the secondary market to recoup their losses." I reached into my folder for the final time. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy paper stamped with a bright red seal that looked like blood on snow. I slid it across the table. It stopped right in front of his shaking hands. Read the buyer's name, Otis. The debt note was purchased last week by a private holding company called Phoenix Rising LLC. Otis looked at the paper, confusion clouding his eyes. He did not understand. So I leaned in to make sure he heard every syllable. "Phoenix Rising LLC has one sole proprietor, me, Nia Washington. I bought your debt, Otis. I own the loan you defaulted on." His mouth fell open. He looked from the paper to me, his brain trying to process the impossibility of it. "And under the laws of this state, the moment you defaulted, the lien holder has the right to accelerate foreclosure on your portion of the asset. I filed the paperwork yesterday afternoon. This document confirms that your equity has been seized to satisfy the debt. You do not own half a house anymore. You do not own a single brick, a single shingle, or a speck of dust in this dining room." The transformation was instant. The blood drained from Otis's face so fast I thought he might faint. His skin turned a sickly, ashy gray. His mouth hung open in a silent scream of disbelief. His legs gave out beneath the table and he collapsed back into his chair. A man who had gambled his life away and just realized the house always wins. And today, I was the house. I checked the slender gold watch on my wrist. It was exactly 11:15 in the morning. Church service would be starting soon down the street, but Deacon Otis would not be leading the opening prayer today. "Detective Williams," I said, not looking away from my stepfather. "It is time." Williams nodded once and raised a hand toward the front window. Immediately, the heavy sound of boots echoed on the hardwood floor of the entryway. 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the dining room, filling the space with the imposing weight of the law. One of them unhooked a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. They glinted in the Sunday morning sunlight like jewelry for the damned. Otis Jackson, the officer, announced, his voice flat and leaving no room for argument. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and domestic assault. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." The reality crashed down on Otis. He looked at the handcuffs, then at the table where his life lay in ruins, and finally at the officers moving toward him. Panic, raw and ugly, took over. He scrambled backward, his chair tipping over with a loud crash. He turned to the one person he had spent 3 years manipulating, the woman he thought was too weak to ever stand against him. "Beatrice," he cried out, his voice shrill and desperate. "Baby, please, tell them it is a mistake. Tell them I am your husband. Do not let them take me. Help me, baby. You cannot let them do this to me." My mother stood up slowly. She looked small standing next to the police officers, but she stood straighter than I had seen her in years. She wiped the tears from her face and looked down at the man who had bullied her into submission. She did not flinch when he reached a hand toward her. "Do not call me baby," she said, her voice shaking, but crystal clear. "And do not call me your wife. You never loved me, Otis. You only loved this house. You loved my money. And now you have neither." She turned her back on him, facing the window, refusing to give him even one last look of pity. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The officers hauled Otis out of the dining room, his expensive shoes dragging across the floorboards he tried to steal. He was still screaming about his rights and his showroom as they shoved him through the front door, but the sound was cut short when the heavy oak slammed shut. The silence that rushed back into the house was profound. It wasn't empty silence. It was the sound of a fever breaking, of a storm finally passing. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if the house itself was finally exhaling after holding its breath for 3 years. I turned back to the table where our interrupted breakfast sat cooling. I picked up the platter of buttermilk biscuits I had baked before dawn. I chose the biggest, softest one and broke it open, watching the steam rise into the quiet room. I slathered it with butter and placed it gently on a china plate. I walked over to the head of the table, the spot Otis had claimed as his throne, and set the plate down in front of my mother. "Eat, Mama," I said softly. "From now on, no one sits at the head of this table except you." My mother looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. Across the table, Maya and Brad watched me. There was love in their eyes, certainly, but there was also something new, a kind of terrified respect. They had seen the monster, but they had also seen the woman who slayed him without raising her voice. My cheek throbbed under the darkening bruise, a painful reminder of the battle. But as I took a bite of my own breakfast, I realized I had never felt lighter. The food tasted like victory. This story reminds us that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting, but the one quietly taking notes. Otis mistook Nia's silence for submission, never realizing she was building a legal cage out of his own secrets. True power doesn't require raised fists. It requires financial literacy and the courage to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Nia proved that while abusers may thrive in the dark, they cannot survive the light of truth. Never let anyone convince you that you are powerless, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Hit like if you agree that success is the best revenge, and subscribe to join our community of survivors and warriors.